Is it tough being a Black woman in academia? According to one blog post author, it's really lousy getting so many interviews and job offers. Yeah, you heard that right. That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. In my last video, I explored the upside-down world of victim politics in which self-proclaimed victims take advantage of their victim privilege to make outrageous demands and behave badly, while the so-called privileged suffer discrimination without recourse, as has happened recently in the mathematics department at Melbourne University, which is discriminating against men quite outrageously in its hiring. While I was researching that case at Melbourne, I came across a 2015 blog post entitled, "How Are You Diverse? How the Academic Job Market Highlighted My Racial Insecurities." The article highlights some of the ironic effects of preferential hiring policies on those it favors, on the women, sexual minorities, and people of color whom universities have been incentivized to hire over the past decade. The author of the article, a young Black female PhD named Keisha Ray, talks about the 59 job interviews she was given in her search for academic employment and the experience of promoting herself as a candidate whose hiring would contribute to diversity in the academy. "How are you diverse?" she was actually asked, point blank. The answer would seem rather obvious, she comments, given her evident blackness and femaleness, but nonetheless, she answered that question at some length for many interviews. Over time, the persistence of the question caused the reality to dawn on Ray that very likely the high number of interviews she was receiving reflected attempts by hiring committees to meet state-imposed diversity requirements. And the realization that hiring committees were not really interested in her, Keisha Ray, but in proving to their school's diversity committee that they had considered hiring a Black woman. Well, that experience, that realization was not pleasant. She writes, quote, when you are aware that departments are increasingly being required to at least show they have made an attempt to hire diverse faculty, you start to question why you are really conducting an interview. Am I here so faculty can show their dean or HR department that at least they interviewed someone diverse? Or the question that all diverse people ask themselves in situations like this, am I here to fill a quota? In many interviews, I believe, the answer for me was yes, end quote. This is a really interesting blog post for its exploration of how preferential hiring practices almost inevitably reduce an applicant's value to a racial or gender category having little to do with individual talents and achievements. Ray admits, in fact, that she wasn't that well qualified for quite a few of the positions she was interviewed for. And she also discusses the frustration of never really knowing whether her suspicions were correct or whether her actual qualifications were attracting potential employers. Added to all of this anxiety was the grating assumption by friends and acquaintances that as a Black woman, she had hit the jackpot in the identity category sweepstakes. No matter how good she really was, many people would inevitably assume that her interviews and job offers had little to do with merit and everything to do with the fact that she was female and Black. She notes that, quote, the sentiment that my diversity gives me an advantage over the competition makes me question if my only qualification for some academic positions was my diversity, end quote. It's a frustrating position for the author, who is still convinced that racist and sexist bias exists in academia, while having to confront the irrefutable perception amongst friends and acquaintances that she has unearned privilege. Despite the frustration of the experience, though, Ray never questions that so-called diversity based on race and sex is necessary. In fact, she remains committed to the idea that the presence of Black women in academia is a good thing in itself. But she's also adamant that, quote, if this is the nature of the academic market, and despite my accomplishments, I am merely a box to be checked by a search committee, then my value is not as a productive colleague, but rather as a quota, end quote. I sympathize with Ray's predicament to some extent because I have myself had the experience of being interviewed for positions and offered jobs at a time when I knew that being female was a major element in my desirability as a prospective hire, and I'll live with that knowledge forever. Often academic job applications at the time when I was applying in 1999, they came with a form that one had to fill out to ascertain whether one was female, of color, Aboriginal, Métis, etc. And that was always alongside the university's stated commitment to diversity. This kind of thing has been going on for a long time. Now, where my sympathy for Ray flags is in her refusal to recognize that, uncomfortable as it might be to have interviews and job offers coming her way because she is, quote, merely a box to be checked, it's far worse to be denied interviews merely because one is not a box to be checked. Ray had 3 job offers, which is 3 more than many qualified and talented white men. She'll have the chance to prove her worth and to make her colleagues forget that she was hired partly because she was Black and female. A lot of white men will never have that chance, and I doubt Ray will ever give them a thought. Cry me a river, white boy, as the saying goes. She remains convinced that Black women are discriminated against in academia and that her own experience of positive discrimination merely adds another layer to her oppression. If she ever had to stop believing in her oppression, she would have to confront some even more uncomfortable truths. Basically, Keisha Ray and others like her want to have it both ways. She wants to conduct her job search in an academic culture committed to atoning for its supposed sins by seeking to hire people like her. She wants to continue to see herself as one of those more sinned against than sinning. But she also wants to be valued quite apart from these unchosen features as an individual with unique skills and intellectual capacity. It reminds me of the period when I worked at the University of Saskatchewan, which was in the midst of the same kind of hiring that Ray experienced in 1999 to 2003. There was a protocol drawn up by members of our union about how we should all think about and practice what was then called equity hiring, which was racial and gender preference. According to the protocol, we were supposed to convince ourselves and everyone else that even while we were hiring candidates because they were female or non-white or whatever, that we were really hiring them because they were so very good. There was actually a clause in the protocol that after the hiring, we were all supposed to spread the word around the university about how excited we were to have hired X because of all her intellectual merits, and we were not to speak of X as an equity appointment. It was doublethink, and a lot of people were pretty good at it. But in reality, it can't be both. You either compete on a level playing field in which hiring committees seek to be gender and color blind, and in which the only thing you bring to the job competition is your intelligence and ability. Or you compete on an uneven field in which your skin color and or sex gives you a special advantage that has nothing to do with merit. So choose. If it's the latter, if you like the advantage you gain through the social justice framework, then naturally you'll never know how much of a role your race and or gender played in your hiring, and that uncertainty will be your companion throughout your career. People will assume you were hired, at least partly because you fit a category and you can't tell them they're wrong. You could work to abolish preferential treatment, but if you don't, you can't ask your society to pretend it isn't happening. So cry me a river, black girl.